Hey, good Wednesday evening. Thanks for joining us again, being back with us. I was thinking about something. Pastors probably all over the country are going to get really used to live streaming services and Bible studies, and probably going to get pretty good at it. But I don't want you guys to expect us to do it like this all the time. Once we get started again, able to go back to church, we really want you back in church. We miss you guys, and we appreciate you being in God's house when we're able to do that. But we're glad that we're able to do social media and get God's word out like this. And so I appreciate you joining us. If you want to share this video or watch parties or whatever is more effective, Christy's a little bit better in Facebook than I am, but whatever is a little more effective at getting the message out, then we appreciate you doing it and helping us out. And you just keep on doing what you're doing. We're in Daniel chapter 3. Or Daniel chapter 4 tonight. Last week we did chapter 3, and I want to remind you of the first couple of chapters. Daniel chapter 2, or actually Daniel chapter 1, Daniel and some of his friends get taken away by Nebuchadnezzar from Jerusalem back into Babylon as captives. They're trained in all the Babylonian literature, art, music, language, and attempts at training them in their religion. They even changed their name. None of that bothers Daniel really until they try to get him to change his religion. Then he stands his ground, and because he stands his ground and does what's right, he gets in good with the magistrate, the chief of all the young guys that get carried away. And so he becomes a little more prominent. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a nightmare, and he calls all of his wise men in, and if you remember, it's kind of a surreal scene. He tells them that he doesn't want them just to give an interpretation; he wants to tell the dream too, which is incredibly difficult to do. And the Bible implies in chapter 2 that he doesn't trust them. That they had let him down before. They had told him one thing before and not followed through. So he really doesn't trust them. So they can't do it. He says, basically, if you guys do it, there's a reward. If you don't, you'll be destroyed. They can't do it. Daniel begs for their life when Daniel comes on the scene, and the king spares them. Daniel comes on. They ask Daniel, the king, can he do it? Daniel says, really, no, I can't do it, but God that I serve can do it. So Nebuchadnezzar lets Daniel tell him the dream, and his dream is a statue, if you remember, that's 4 varying levels of precious metals. They get less valuable as they go down. Head of gold, Daniel later says that's you, Nebuchadnezzar. Then it's a chest of silver. Then it's thighs of bronze, and then it's feet and legs or toes of clay mixed with iron. And we go on to know that the Babylonian Empire was the first, the greatest, with Nebuchadnezzar at the head. And then it goes to the Medo-Persians, represented by the silver. Then the Greeks, represented by the bronze. And then it goes into the Roman Empire. It even makes allusions to the revised Roman Empire, the European Union that we have now, because the word that it uses to describe those feet and toes is a mixture of things, not one solid material. So it's very prophetic. And if you remember, chapters 1 through 6 are mostly historical. It has some prophetic elements in it that we'll see, but it's mostly historical. Chapter 6 through 12 is mostly prophetic. So Daniel tells him the dream and tells him the interpretation. He says, here's the interpretation. There's going to be a statue, and you're the head, and then there's going to be this stone that looks like it was not cut with hands that kind of flies into the statue and hits the feet and crushes the thing. And so not really thinking about that, but thinking about him being the head of gold, chapter 3 begins with immediately. As soon as he hears about the dream and the interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar sets up a statue out on the plains in Shinar, and he gets all the people out there. He says, I want everybody to come for what he calls the dedication. It is symbolic of, I think, the Antichrist. And here's where there's some interpretational differences. And nobody knows for sure. We can't be dogmatic about these things because it's impossible to know for sure. We only can get clues from the textual evidence. And when we put it all together, not nitpicking, you'll see some people that kind of pick verses out of context to try to fit their paradigm or their theme of things. And that's a dangerous proposition to take. But when you look at it as a whole, I interpret all of this, especially these prophetic things in Daniel, as a pre-tribulational episode or event or premillennial events. And so as we go through this, I'm not going to be overt about it, but in the things that I try to bring out, it's going to have that kind of mindset behind it. Nebuchadnezzar kind of makes this peace treaty with the Jews, brings them out for this dedication, then turns it into worship. And he says, when you hear this music, bow down. Well, we know the story, the 3 Hebrew children do not bow down. And after a second chant, they get thrown into the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar sees 4 men in the fire. One, he says, looks like a son of God, probably a theophany of Jesus, one of those pre-incarnated visions or appearances of Christ. And the boys are spared. And Nebuchadnezzar ends chapter 3 with a doxology, something that you wouldn't expect from a pagan king. It's short-lived, and we don't know the final outcome of all this because, of course, we don't know anybody's heart. But this is a short-lived change of heart for Nebuchadnezzar. He gets it temporarily, but then we're going to see in chapter 4 he goes backwards. So let's look at chapter 4 and look how it starts off, because chapter 4 is a very unusual, it's a really strange chapter, to be honest with you. It's a declaration of a pagan king that it's just kind of out of place where it's at. It may be here to show us that there was a change in the heart of Nebuchadnezzar that changed back. In other words, he got it. It's kind of like the seed and the sower. It fell on the rocky ground or the thorny ground, and it goes in, but it really doesn't take hold of his life, so it really doesn't change him. There's a lot of people out there that may even be listening to me tonight. They're like that. You've heard about God's Word, and you've heard preachers preach on it. You've heard teachers teach on it. You've heard choirs sing about it. You've read it in books and in magazines, but it just really doesn't make a lot of sense to you because it really, you've never let it just go down and change who you are. So this is where we're at in chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar the king reigned for about 43 years. He became king in 605 BC, so his reign ended around 562 BC. The events in chapter 4, as we read through this, are going to take place over the span of about 8 years. So this is an 8-year episode that takes place in chapter 4. Probably starts around 575 BC, and if it does start around 575 BC, then that means Daniel is going to be about 46 years old. So he's taken into captivity when he's a young teenager, and he's grown up basically in Babylon in the palace, and now he's going to be about 46 years old. So let's look at chapter 4 if you have your Bible, and I encourage you to do that. Read along with me, look along, whether it's on your phone, an iPad, whatever you use, but look along with me, and we're going to look at the second dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Look at verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders with the Most High God, which the Most High God has done for me. Verse 3, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. So we can start right there, and let me point out just a couple of things. Nebuchadnezzar, in this pre-tribulational, premillennial type idea of things, Nebuchadnezzar represents for us or becomes a type of Gentiles in the tribulation period. This is what Nebuchadnezzar is going to represent in this story. When he says, may your peace abound, that's just a typical greeting. monarchs in the 5th, 6th century, 7th century. That's just a typical greeting for a Middle Eastern monarch. Now, this story is going to be the last time we meet Nebuchadnezzar. We're not going to hear about him anymore. He's going to die. There's going to be a series of successions after him, starting with his son, evil Marduk. After that, we're going to go down to Belteshazzar, who's going to be the king in chapter 5. But here's a pagan king. Look at verse 2. He's not ashamed to make a public proclamation about the great things that God has done for him. He's pagan. He really didn't know God. He got a little bit of who God was in chapter 3 with the 3 Hebrew children, but he doesn't know a whole lot about God. And so here in chapter 4, he's going to have this dream, but before it goes into the dream, it gives us a little insight into Nebuchadnezzar's mindset. And so he says in verse 2, just look at the way he words this. It seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. That's a proclamation about the goodness of God. Verse 3 now. Verse 3 has an kind of an equated verse in Psalm chapter 66, verse 16. Let me read Psalm 66:16 to you, and look at how it ties in to Daniel chapter 4. Psalm 66:16. Come and hear, all who fear God, and I will tell of what he has done for my soul. That's the same kind of idea. This is what Nebuchadnezzar is saying. Nebuchadnezzar is saying, it's good for me to tell you about how God is treating me. So he's not ashamed to do that. A lot of us that's been Christians for a long time are ashamed to give God glory in public. But Nebuchadnezzar is not, even though he's not fully converted. He's not fully convinced yet. So that's the first 3 verses. Now, verses 4 through 9 sets up the second dream. And it's a really disturbing dream, just like the last one. It's a nightmare type scenario, and it really upsets the king. Look at verse 4. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. And so verse 4, he basically says, I've had a great life. I've really had a great life. And look, it warns us about Christians being at ease in Zion. In other words, being comfortable with what we have. I think one of the greatest enemies of the advancement of the gospel is complacency. You know, I just get too comfortable. I mean, we get comfortable. Think about what's going on now. Think about the virus situation, and from what I understand, I hadn't saw all the details yet, but the governor's just issued a shelter-in-place order for the whole state until April 13th. So think about that. We can't meet at church. We can't meet on Wednesday nights, have our Bible study, and I'll be honest with you, I'm really hungry right now, and I hadn't had a chance to eat yet. I'll do so afterwards. One of the things I miss is our fellowship meals on Wednesday night. We can't do that right now. I can't go visit the shut-ins in my church. I can't go visit the people that are sick in the hospitals. I can call, I can text. But that's not the same thing. And so you and I are in a position where it's going to get really easy to be comfortable. We're going to get comfortable with the status quo, the way things are. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to pray real hard that God doesn't let you get too comfortable, that when the church doors open again, you'd rather stay at home and watch this on TV. That's not a good idea. But this is a church's time to shine. This is a church's time to meet needs and minister. And I know we can't do a lot because we're sheltered in place, quarantined, and all those kind of things. But the church ought to be getting the message out. One of the things that 2 Chronicles chapter 7 tells us is that things happen. Disasters happen. Locusts happen. Droughts happen. Fires happen. Viruses happen. And God says, when my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray. When my people will begin to pray. And that's just a kind of a side note to the story, and I'm not going to chase that rabbit right now. I want to get back to the text in Daniel chapter 4. But it's time as a church not get comfortable, and we start trying to get the message out the best we can. So here's Nebuchadnezzar, and he says in verse 4, he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm at ease in my palace. I've got everything I want. Luke chapter 2 verse 16 tells us a story, or Luke chapter 12 verse 16 tells us a story about a man that said, I've got lots of stuff. I've got lots of crops. God has really blessed me. My life has been abundant. My life has been fruitful. I've got all these things. And he says, so much so that my barns are too full. He says, I have accumulated so many things that I don't have room for them all. So instead of being generous and saying, maybe I can donate some of this stuff I don't use, or maybe I can help a poor family that may be in desperate need of some food right now, he says, I know what I'll do. I'll build bigger barns. I'll tear down this little tiny barn I have, and I'll build bigger, greater barns so that I can fill it up with all my things. And then God spoke to him and said, you're really a fool, because tonight your soul is going to be required of you. So what are all these things going to do for you? That's what Nebuchadnezzar, he has done got to the place now where he saw God work in the Hebrew children. He has a little bit of respect for God, just a little. I think basically what Nebuchadnezzar has done is kind of slide the Hebrew God in with the other Babylonian gods. He doesn't stand alone as the only one. He's just now one in a culmination of a lot. And so he's giving this tribute, but he really didn't get it. So in verse 4 he says, I'm really enjoying my things. Look at verse 5. He says, now I'm going to tell you this nightmare. And remember, because watch how this gets different and it gets weird. It's different than the first dream. Look what it says. I saw a dream and it made me fearful. It's a nightmare. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. So I gave orders. This is a deja vu. I gave orders to bring into my presence all the wise men of Babylon, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the conjurers, the Chaldeans, the diviners came in. I related the dream to them, but they could not make its interpretation known to me. Now you see what's different? Did you notice what's different here? He says, I called in all those magicians, all those sorcerers, and I related the dream to them. First time he didn't. The first time they said, tell us the dream. He said, no, you tell me the dream and interpretation. They said, no man can do that. Daniel came in and did it. Now this time he really don't trust them one bit. So he calls them in, I guess out of a symbolic duty, or I don't know why he does it, but he calls them in. He relates the dream to them. He says, I ain't going to fool with you this time. This time he's going to tell you what I had a dream about. And so he tells them the dream, but look what it says at the last part of verse 7. But they could not make the interpretation known. That's the way it's going to be. Now look at verse 8. But finally Daniel came in. Can you picture Daniel? It's almost like if you're filming a movie and the main characters are in this big ballroom, the king sitting on his throne, all these magicians are in there, and the king says, here's my dream. He tells them the dream, and they're just one by one looking at each other, and they're like, hey, we don't know. We can't tell you. We can't help you with it. And it's just this real sad scene, and everybody's just real, and then all of a sudden the doors burst open, and you can almost hear this crescendoing type music all over, and Daniel walks in. It's like Daniel likes a big entrance. And Daniel likes the grand stage. So Daniel walks in. Daniel came in, and it says in here, whose name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In other words, that's his changed name. That's his Babylonian name. And he says about Daniel, in whom, in Daniel, is the spirit of the holy gods. Not the holy gods, Jehovah God. And he says, I related the dream to him, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, since I know that a spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery baffles you, tell me the visions of my dream, which I have seen, along with its interpretation. So Daniel has to do both. The wise men get the dream. Daniel has to do it and the interpretation. Now look at verse 10, because here's the dream itself. And here's what can be is going to be a nightmare situation for Nebuchadnezzar. Look at verse 10. Now these were the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed. I was looking, and behold, there was a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. So he saw a large tree. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all living creatures fed themselves from it. Can you visualize the dream? He says here, this is the dream. He said, I saw a tree, mighty tree, big tree. It grew very strong, very large. And he said, in its branches the birds lived. The fruit that it produced fed the animals. It was a great tree. Verse 12, he said, its foliage was beautiful. All right, now watch verse 13. I was looking in the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, an angel, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows. Chop down the tree and cut off its branches. Strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beast flee from under it and the birds from its branches. Yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field, and let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him share with the beast in the grass of the earth. Now, watch how it starts off this real pastoral, calm scene. He says, I see a tree. It's a great tree. Nebuchadnezzar sees himself as the leader. He sees himself as the provider. That's what this tree is. It's a provider. It's nourishing. It's great. It's strong. It's abundant. And then verse 13, the narrative shifts. He says, as I'm watching this vision, an angel came down. And again, that's it depends on what kind of angel, what his message is. It could be a peaceful type thing. But look what the angel says. The angel said, cut down the tree. Just get rid of the tree. And he said, as you're cutting down the tree, he said, cut off its branches, strip off all of its foliage, and scatter its fruit. Then he says, let the beast flee from under it and the birds from its branches. It was just totally demolished the tree. And Nebuchadnezzar saw himself as a leader. So this is the nightmare. He sees this great tree that's full and providing and all that it's doing. And then all of a sudden the angel says, let's get rid of it. And so he's having this nightmare. Now watch verse 15, because verse 15 is, and you got to watch these subtle shifts, because it's going to tell you now really what the dream's about. Look at verse 15. Yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground. So cut the tree down, but leave the stump, with a band of iron and bronze around it. Do you remember the feet and the toes of the statue? Iron toes, bronze thighs. Watch verse 15. In the new grass of the field, and let him. There's a subtle change. First he's talking about a tree. Let it. Cut it down. Let the birds flee from it. Now in verse 15 he says, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. It's a subtle shift, and it's the nightmare part. Verse 15 is the nightmare part. All right? Because the tree now is personified, and when the angel says cut down the tree and let him be drenched with the dew, it now, since the tree is now personified, it becomes like a person. Now the dream is not about cutting down a tree, it's about cutting down a person. That's why it's a nightmare. Cutting down a tree, no big deal. Nebuchadnezzar's not going to be upset a tree gets cut down. He's going to be upset that a person gets cut down, especially the person that it is. So look at verse 15 again. Let leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it, in the new grass of the field, and let him, talking about Nebuchadnezzar, let him share with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Give verse 16. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let a beast mind be given to him. and let 7 periods of time pass over him. So, we'll look at verse 17. This sentence is by decree of the angelic watchers, and the decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whom he wishes, and sets over it the lowliest of men. This is the dream which I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, Belteshazzar, will tell me its interpretation, inasmuch as none of the wise men of the kingdom is able to make known to me the interpretation, but you are able, for a spirit of the holy gods is in you. So he says that's the dream. And he says, now I want you to tell me the interpretation of the dream. Go back to verse 17 and look what he says. This sentence is by the decree of the angelic watchers. A decision is a command of the holy ones, in order that the living may know, this is important for us, that the living may know that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he bestows on it whom he wishes. Why did he have the dream? The reason for the dream is that God abhors the arrogance of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar sitting up in his palace thinking, I got it all. I got money, I got wives, I got food, I got land, I got territory, I got all I could want. God doesn't like arrogance. The haughty, the prideful will fall, the humble will be exalted. God works in paradoxes. And so now he gives Nebuchadnezzar this dream, and Daniel is going to now relate to him the dream, because the dream is this tree that's beautiful. It houses the birds. It shades and feeds the beasts of the field. It's awesome. The angel comes down, cuts it down, cuts it to the stump. And then the angel says, let him be watered and drenched by the dew of the ground like the beasts of the field. So verse 18, look what Nebuchadnezzar does. He calls Daniel in and says, Daniel, I need some help. Look at verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, was appalled for a while as his thoughts alarmed him, as he knew what it meant. The king responded and said, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar replied, my lord, if only the dream applied to those who hate you and its interpretation to your adversary. That's a very caring comment by Daniel. Daniel said, first of all, he can't talk. He's too upset. I mean, him and Nebuchadnezzar is kind of got to be frenemies, I guess. I mean, they respect each other for their positions, not their worship, but their positions. So he calls Daniel in, tells him the dream. Daniel immediately knows what it's about. And so he gets kind of fearful, he gets kind of silent. Nebuchadnezzar knows what's going on, and he says, Daniel, don't worry about it. Just tell me the truth. Just be honest with me. It's a message for us. Because all of us know somebody that don't know Jesus. If they don't know Jesus, they have no hope. The Bible says that when we die, we spend eternity in one of two places, either heaven or it's either hell. If we know somebody that don't know Jesus, we know they're going to hell. There's not a time to sugarcoat that. There's not a time to beat around the bush and try to be Mr. Nice Guy. It's time to just lay the cards on the table, be blunt about what's going on, and tell people the truth. Now, you can do it in love. There's some people just have no tact. But you have to tell them the truth. And so Daniel says, King, I wish this was about anybody but you. He says, I wish this dream was about somebody that hated you or you hated, but I can't lie to you. I got to tell you the truth. So look at verse 22. It is you, he said. This tree is you, O king, for you have become great and grown strong, and your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. In that the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground, but with a band of iron and bronze around it in the new grass of the field. And let him, there's the him again, as opposed to the it of the tree, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and let him share with the beasts of the field until 7 periods of time pass over him. And we know that's going to be 7 years. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High. In other words, it's not my opinion, it's what God says, which has come upon my Lord the king, that you, king, be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field. In other words, this is going to happen to you. I wish I didn't have to tell you this. This is what's going to happen to you. You're going to be driven away from mankind, from society, from that lofty palace, from all that you have, and you're going to live with the beasts of the field. Look how it continues in verse 25. And you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind. In other words, God's in charge, not you, and bestows it on whomever he wishes. And in that it was commanded to leave the stump with the roots of the tree, your kingdom will be assured to you after you recognize that it is heaven that rules. Therefore, O king, may my advice be pleasing to you. Break away now from your sins by doing righteousness, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, in case there may be a prolonging of your prosperity. So he says, this is what's going to happen, king. He says, you're going to be driven away from mankind. You're going to be out in the field with the beast of the field. You're going to have dew on you like the field. You're going to eat grass like the cattle. Until you realize that God rules. Until you get it. Now let's wrap this up. Look at verse 28. All this happened to Nebuchadnezzar the king. So it come to fulfillment, come to fruition. Verse 29. 12 months later, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. The king reflected and said, is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built as a royal residence for the might of my power and for the glory of my majesty? While the word was in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven saying, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, sovereignty has been removed from you, and you'll be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place will be with the beasts of the field. You'll be given grass to eat like cattle, and 7 periods of time, or 7 years, will pass over you until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows on it on whomever he wishes. Immediately, watch it, immediately, the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind and began eating grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair had grown like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. So look how this starts off now. Daniel interprets it. 12 months pass. So he thinks he's got away with it. He thinks, I dodged a bullet there. Let me tell you something about God. There's 2 things about God that's irrelevant to this. Number 1, you can't judge your circumstances and try to determine in your circumstances how much God loves you. God's love for you is not determined through your circumstances. Just because they're bad doesn't mean God doesn't love you. And just because they're good doesn't mean that God loves you more. You can't do anything to make God love you less. You can't do anything to make God love you more. But number 2, watch this, and here's the biggie, because a lot of us think we get away with it. You cannot judge the passage of time and think you've gotten away with sin. Just because you sin and there's no immediate punishment doesn't mean God's forgotten about it or let you off the hook. So 12 months later, Nebuchadnezzar's walking on the roof of his palace, and look what he said. I, Nebuchadnezzar, built this. This is Babylon the Great. I did this by my might. I did all these things. God's voice from heaven came in and said, oh, no. He said, you got this wrong. You didn't do anything. I just blessed you. And he said, from this point on, that judgment that Daniel told you about 12 months ago, well, it's going to happen. And so it says immediately he was driven out. And look what it said. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven. His hair grew like eagle's feathers. Can you imagine a man now whose hair is like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird claws? That's what he's driven to. God breaks the prideful. Look at verse 34. But at the end of that period, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my reason returned to me. I came back into my right mind. My reason returned to me. The prodigal son, you remember what it says about him? He came to himself. When we realize that God is in control, when we realize that God knows what he's doing and we don't, that's when God can do business with us. He says, my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. And then he gives us a doxology. And it's a look at verse 37. And I want to skip down here because we're running out of time, and I want you to listen to this. This has to be Nebuchadnezzar is the greatest monarch in his time. These are his closing words. Let's go back to verse 35 or verse 34. Look at his doxology, his praise, talking about God. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, but he does according to his will in the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of earth, and no one can ward off his hand. Oh, say to him, what have you done? And then he talks about his reason of returning. Now look at verse 37. Last words we hear from Nebuchadnezzar. We don't see him again. The closing words from one of the greatest monarchs of his day. Look what he said. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are true and his ways just. And he is able, watch this, to humble those who walk in pride. That's his closing comment. If you look at Matthew chapter 25, Isaiah chapter 66, Zechariah chapter 14, Nebuchadnezzar is going to typify Gentiles during the tribulation period. Those that are left behind. Those that are, when the church is raptured out, those that are left behind, he's going to typify those people. Those ones that are left behind. Now, if you want to read Amos chapter 2, Amos chapter 2 tells you what was going on in the world during these 7 years that this was happening to King Nebuchadnezzar. But this is a lesson of somebody who is playing games with God. They say they get it. They give God praise, but then they fall back on their own pride. God hates pride. God hates the arrogant. He doesn't like that. Listen, I don't know your situation. I don't know how you... I don't know if you believe in God. I hope that you do. If you don't, call me. But I hope you put God first. I hope you know that things on this earth are still under his purview. God doesn't cause everything. We live in a world that's cursed by sin. And I want you to hear this about this virus. People say, why does God cause all these things? It's not necessarily that God causes them. Sin causes them. We live in a world that was created to be perfect, but because mankind couldn't keep it perfect, sin is now here. And so the things that God wanted to be perfect are now imperfect. So viruses happen. Accidents happen. People lie. People cheat. People steal. Things happen. All right? And so that's the world we live in. Now, just because God didn't cause it, and some things he may, but just because God didn't cause it doesn't mean that he didn't speak from within it. So what's God trying to tell us? Maybe God's trying to say, don't take church for granted. I mean, right now we can't go. I mean, the place is empty. When I'm there every day and I look out at that auditorium and I think, boy, on Sundays this thing ought to be filled. And it's not. And it wouldn't be even if we had the ability to go to church right now. Because people take it for granted. Maybe in the midst of all this virus that's going around, maybe God's trying to speak to you and tell you not to take your church for granted anymore. Maybe you don't go to church. Spring Creek would love to have you 2636 Chulio Road, Rome. We'd love to have you. When they give us the go-ahead, when they give us the green light, you come on. Matter of fact, Easter Sunday, we're going to have a drive-in, and we're going to have come as you are, but stay in your car. I don't care if you come in your pajamas and a robe. I don't care if you dress up in your Easter finest. But we're going to come, we're going to park, we're going to stay in the car. Hopefully, we're going to be able to transmit the service over your FM radio. And we're going to have Easter service together, but apart. Abiding by the quarantine. Maybe you want to come and be with us that day. Maybe you want to say, you know what? This is a great first day for me to be in church. I can come where I don't have to shake a lot of hands and meet a lot of new people. I can just come see what it's all about. You can come. And then maybe you'll like us. And then maybe when we can meet in the building, you'll come back. Maybe you're a member of Spring Creek or some other church. Maybe you haven't been to church in a while. Maybe you've been neglected. Maybe you come on Sunday morning, but not Sunday night. I'm not trying to butt into your business or being meddlesome. A lot of people say preachers start really meddling in your business. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to say churches meet on Sunday night. We do. We love to have you there. Wednesday night, we have great programs for youth. We have over 30 youth that meet on Wednesday nights. They have lessons. They play games. We take them on trips. We have leaders that are phenomenal. Maybe you're a young person or a parent of a young person. Maybe you'd like to start bringing them. We have tremendous program for smaller kids. We have 2 brand new facilities up there. We'd love to have your children. We have Bible study just like this every Wednesday night. Except on Wednesdays we can ask questions. And maybe my wife's not watching right now, but she usually asks the most. So it's okay to ask questions. We have a good time in the Lord together. Maybe God is telling you through all this that you're taking church for granted. Maybe He's telling you you're taking His Lordship for granted. I don't know what God's trying to tell you, but you need to listen. God's speaking to you. Don't be like Nebuchadnezzar. God had to humble him. Be humble. Those are the ones that God exalts. Thank you for watching. Pray for our church. Pray for your church. And I'm not trying to get you just to come to Spring Creek if you're a member somewhere else. If you're a member of a church, support your church. Support your pastor. Call and check on him. Make sure he's not depressed right now, because it's depressing not being able to be around our church family. Call your pastor and say, or text your pastor and say, Pastor, I want to make a commitment to you that when the doors open to our church again, I'm going to be faithful. I'm not going to take it for granted anymore. Maybe that's the good that's going to come out of this. God bless you all. Hope you have a good night. See you next Wednesday.